Sunday Night Late Show.
My next guest is no stranger to the Ed Sullivan Theater.
Thanks again to President Barack Obama. Go on sale for the Obama Presidential Center tomorrow morning, and it opens on June 19th.
She won America's heart with one audition. She built an empire out of nothing. And for years, she carried a secret so heavy that even her closest fans had no idea what was really happening behind the scenes of her marriage. This is the story of Kelly Clarkson, the girl from a broken home in Texas who became a superstar, the wife who quietly discovered her own husband was profiting off her career in ways the law never allowed, and the mother who chose to stay silent for the sake of her children until she simply couldn't anymore. What she went through, what she finally revealed, and how her story took a turn nobody saw coming. That's what we're getting into today. Before the Grammys, before the talk show, before millions of records sold, Kelly Clarkson was just a kid from Burleson, Texas, trying to survive a childhood that gave her very little stability. Her parents split when she was young, and the family was pulled apart in the process. She grew up watching her mother work to keep the lights on, in a strict, faith-centered household where showing up and getting through the day mattered more than dreaming big. Nobody in that house was thinking about record deals. They were thinking about rent. Music found her almost by accident. A choir teacher happened to hear her singing in the hallway of her middle school and pushed her to audition for the choir, even though Kelly had never taken a lesson in her life. She didn't think much of her own voice, but she said yes anyway, and that small decision ended up being the first domino in a life that would eventually put her on stages in front of millions of people. After high school, she had scholarship offers from respected music programs, including schools that plenty of aspiring singers would have killed to attend. She turned them all down. Instead of a classroom, she wanted real experience. So she worked whatever job she could find, answering phones, waiting tables, working promotional gigs, just to scrape together enough money to record a demo. That demo went nowhere. Label after label passed on her, telling her she was too much of one thing and not enough of another. When she moved to Los Angeles to try her luck in person, things got worse before they got better. Every door she knocked on stayed shut, and then, almost unbelievably, the apartment she was living in caught fire, and she lost nearly everything. She went home to Texas, with nothing to show for the risk she'd taken. Then came the audition that changed everything. In 2002, on a dare from a friend, she tried out for a brand new singing competition that nobody had heard of yet, called American Idol. The production was rough around the edges. Contestants were literally sent to a mall to find their own outfits. But none of that mattered once Kelly opened her mouth. She won the very first season with well over half the vote, and her debut single made a jump up the charts that broke a record the Beatles had held for decades. Almost overnight, an unknown girl from Texas became one of the most talked about new voices in the country. What almost nobody knew at the time was that the man who would eventually become her husband and her manager was already part of her orbit. She met Brandon Blackstock in 2006 at an award show rehearsal. He worked in artist management, and his family had deep roots in the country music industry. His father, Narvel Blackstock, ran a well-known management company, and his stepmother was country legend Reba McEntire. Nothing happened between them right away. It wasn't until years later, once their paths crossed again, that a relationship began. They got engaged in December 2012 and married in October 2013 at a picturesque farm in Tennessee. On the surface, it looked like the kind of pairing tabloids love, a chart-topping performer and a savvy industry insider who understood her world from the inside. They built a blended family together. Brandon already had 2 children from a previous marriage, and he and Kelly went on to have 2 more of their own, a daughter, River Rose, born in 2014, and a son, Remington, born in 2016. From the outside, their life looked like a highlight reel, vacations, family photos, red carpets. But Kelly has since said, in her own words during interviews, that the reality of that marriage often felt far lonelier than it looked. She's described feeling like she was carrying the emotional weight of parenting largely on her own, even while she was still legally married, all while juggling a demanding career that included a daytime talk show and a seat on The Voice. Behind the family photos, there was also a business relationship that would eventually become the center of a very public legal fight. Brandon wasn't just Kelly's husband. Through his father's company, Starstruck Entertainment, he also worked as her manager, negotiating deals on her behalf for years. In June of 2020, Kelly filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. That filing was really just the surface of something much bigger that was about to come out. Months after the divorce filing, Starstruck sued Kelly, claiming she owed unpaid commissions. Kelly pushed back, and in doing so, she opened up a much bigger question. Was Brandon even legally allowed to be negotiating those deals in the first place? Under California law, only a licensed talent agent is permitted to procure work for an artist. A manager, even a spouse, isn't supposed to be doing that job. Kelly argued that Brandon had crossed that line for years, collecting commissions on deals like her role on The Voice, a partnership with a home goods retailer, and a cruise line sponsorship, despite never holding the license the law required. The case went to a labor commission hearing in early 2023, where both sides testified. Kelly herself took the stand and described how Brandon had been the one who first told her NBC wasn't interested in her for The Voice because the network wanted, in his words at the time, a different kind of image for the role, only for him to then be the one who eventually brokered the deal himself and collected a commission on it. It was the kind of detail that made the case feel less like a routine business dispute and more like a woman discovering, piece by piece, just how much had been happening without her full understanding. In November 2023, the labor commissioner ruled largely in Kelly's favor, ordering Brandon to repay her more than $2.6 million in commissions tied to deals he wasn't legally authorized to make. Notably, the ruling didn't require him to repay commissions related to her talk show specifically. That piece of the dispute was still headed toward a separate trial. Brandon appealed the decision, and both sides were bracing for a public trial set for August 2024 that could have put even more details on the record, including testimony from talent agents at Kelly's own agency. But just months before that trial was set to begin, both parties reached a confidential settlement, closing the book on the legal fight without airing every remaining detail in open court. By the time all of this was unfolding, Kelly had already been open about how much strain the marriage had put on her long before the lawsuit started. She's spoken about carrying a kind of loneliness that most people around her never saw, about feeling responsible for holding a family together while also being the primary breadwinner and public face of an entire show. The financial and legal side of the split simply confirmed something many fans had already suspected, that the image of a stable, happy partnership had been hiding a much more complicated reality. There was also a lingering dispute over a Montana ranch Kelly had purchased, which became one of the more drawn-out points of conflict during the split. Even though the court didn't grant Brandon any legal claim to stay there, he remained on the property for an extended period before finally being ordered to leave in 2022. It was one more example of how, even after the marriage legally ended, the two of them stayed entangled for years afterward. Their divorce was finalized in March 2022. Kelly received primary custody of their two children, while agreeing to pay significant monthly child and spousal support as part of the settlement, a detail that surprised some fans who assumed spousal support would flow the other way, given that Kelly was the far bigger earner. Around this same period, she also legally changed her personal name to Kelly Brianne, while keeping Clarkson for professional purposes. She's connected that choice to her complicated relationship with her own father, who left the family when she was a child, a wound she had already written about years earlier in one of her most personal songs. Rather than retreat from public life, Kelly leaned into her music as a way of processing everything she'd been through. In June 2023, she released her 10th studio album, a project that critics and longtime fans described as some of her rawest, most emotionally direct work to date. It dealt openly with anger, grief, and the slow process of rebuilding a sense of self after a relationship falls apart. She's talked candidly in interviews since then about therapy, anxiety, and the day-to-day work of learning to co-parent while still figuring out who she was outside of that marriage. By 2025, Kelly appeared to be entering a new, more independent chapter. She parted ways with her longtime record label and launched her own independent label, giving her full creative control for the first time in her career. She released new music under her own terms and prepared for a stripped-down Las Vegas residency that summer, alongside continuing to host her long-running daytime talk show, which remained a steady presence for her even as everything else in her life shifted. But that summer brought a development nobody was expecting. In early August 2025, Kelly announced she was postponing part of her Las Vegas residency, explaining to fans that her children's father had been dealing with a serious illness and that she needed to be fully present for River and Remington during a difficult time. She didn't go into detail about what Brandon was facing. Less than a day later, the news broke that Brandon Blackstock had passed away at his home in Montana at 48 years old after a private battle with melanoma that he had kept out of the public eye for more than 3 years. He died under hospice care, surrounded by family. It was a stunning turn for anyone who had followed their very public legal battle. Despite everything they had been through in court, people close to the situation described Kelly as having remained protective of Brandon once she learned how sick he was, choosing to keep that part of their story private rather than turning it into headlines. In the months since, both Kelly and Brandon's stepmother, Reba McEntire, have spoken about how the children are coping with the loss of their father and about leaning on family and faith to get through it. So how do you make sense of a story like this? It's not a simple villain and victim narrative, even though there was a real legal violation and a real financial reckoning. It's the story of two people who were husband and wife, business partners, and co-parents all at once, in a relationship that blurred lines the law is specifically designed to keep separate. It's the story of a woman who spent years quietly absorbing more than the public understood, who eventually found the courage to hold someone accountable in court, and who then, faced with that same person's sudden illness and death, chose grace over bitterness for the sake of her kids. Kelly Clarkson has never pretended her life has been easy. From a childhood shaped by her father's absence, to a music career that almost didn't happen, to a marriage that looked picture perfect and turned out to be far more complicated, she's built a public identity around honesty rather than image control. That's part of why so many people have stayed loyal to her for more than 2 decades. Not because her life has been flawless, but because she's been willing, again and again, to tell people the truth about it, even when the truth was messy, painful, or came at a cost. Today, she continues to run her talk show, raise River and Remington largely on her own, and build out her independent music career on her own terms. The legal battle with Brandon is closed. The chapter of his illness and passing is one she and her children are still working through privately. Out of the spotlight, she spent her whole adult life inside of. What's left is a woman who clawed her way out of a small Texas town, built an entire career from nothing, survived a very public unraveling of her marriage, and is still, after everything, standing. If this story moved you, or if you learned something about Kelly Clarkson you didn't know before, let us know in the comments. And if you want more honest breakdowns of the stories behind the headlines, make sure you're subscribed, because there's a lot more where this came from.